A young boy fighting cancer approached the royal guard, filled with admiration and quiet courage. He had no idea that his simple gesture would lead to a moment that would touch every heart around him. When the guard broke protocol and removed his hat, the crowd was overcome with emotion, many brought to tears. This is how that unforgettable moment unfolded. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe. Tomorrow, at this same time, we'll share another powerful story that showcases the strength, honor, and discipline of the Royal Guard. You won't want to miss it. The October morning draped itself across London like a familiar blanket, cool and damp, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of awakening city life. At the gates of Buckingham Palace, the ancient ritual of standing guard continued as it had for centuries, unchanged by the passing of time or the shifting of seasons. Guardsman Marcus Webb had positioned himself at his assigned post precisely 43 minutes earlier, his polished boots planted firmly on the worn stone beneath him. The ceremonial uniform he wore, scarlet tunic blazing against the gray morning, golden buttons catching what little sunlight filtered through the clouds, transformed him into something more than a man. He became a symbol, a living embodiment of tradition and unwavering dedication. At 29 years old, Webb possessed the weathered composure of someone who had seen combat in Afghanistan. Before transitioning to this most prestigious of ceremonial roles, his dark eyes, though fixed forward in accordance with protocol, possessed an alertness that came from years of training and experience. Every muscle in his body remained perfectly controlled, every breath measured and deliberate. The familiar parade of early morning visitors had begun their daily pilgrimage to the palace gates. First came the joggers, their rhythmic footsteps creating a percussion against the pavement as they passed with barely a glance. Then followed the photography enthusiasts, arriving before the crowds with their professional equipment, seeking that perfect shot of British ceremonial grandeur. Webb had learned to categorize these visitors in his peripheral vision, without betraying any acknowledgement of their presence. There were the hurried commuters who used the palace as a landmark on their way to work, the tour groups with their matching umbrellas and eager chatter, and the individual tourists who stood transfixed by the pageantry before them. But on this particular morning, something different caught his attention. A small procession approached from the direction of Green Park, moving with the deliberate slowness of those carrying precious cargo. A woman in her early 30s pushed a compact wheelchair, her movements careful and protective. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, telling the story of countless sleepless nights and endless worry. The occupant of the wheelchair was a boy who appeared to be about 8 years old, though his small stature and pale complexion suggested the kind of fragility that came from serious illness. A wear-upon cap covered his head, and a thick hospital blanket was tucked securely around his legs. Despite his obvious physical challenges, there was something remarkably alert and determined in his expression. Tommy Chen had been planning this visit for weeks, ever since his last stay at the Children's Hospital had stretched longer than usual. During those long hours between treatments, when the nausea from chemotherapy made it impossible to focus on books or games, he had discovered videos online of the Royal Guards. Something about their absolute stillness, their unshakable composure, had captivated him completely. "Look at how they stand, Mom," he had whispered to his mother during one of their late-night conversations in the hospital ward. "They never move, no matter what, even when it must hurt to stand so still for so long." His mother, Elena Chen, had recognized something profound in her son's fascination. Here was a child who understood suffering, who faced his own battles with needles and medications and the constant uncertainty of his condition. In these guardsmen, he seemed to find kindred spirits, warriors who endured discomfort with grace and dignity. The wheelchair came to rest approximately 12 feet from Webb's position, positioning Tommy for an optimal view of the guardsman's ceremonial stance. Elena adjusted her son's blanket against the morning chill, then stepped back to allow him the unobstructed observation he had requested. Tommy's focus was immediate and intense. He studied Webb with the concentration of a scholar examining a masterpiece, taking in every detail of the guardsman's bearing. The way Webb's shoulders remained perfectly square, the precise angle of his chin, the measured rhythm of his breathing, all of it fascinated the young boy. "He's been standing exactly like that for almost an hour," Tommy murmured to his mother, his voice filled with admiration. "His back is so straight, and he hasn't moved his hands at all. How does he do it?" Elena followed her son's gaze, seeing the guardsman through Tommy's eyes. There was indeed something impressive about Webb's composure, something that spoke to a discipline and dedication that went far beyond mere performance. This was a man who had committed himself completely to his duty, who had found in that commitment a kind of strength that seemed almost superhuman. Other tourists began to gather round them, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had attracted Tommy. The usual array of cameras and smartphones appeared, capturing images of the stoic figure in his ceremonial splendor. But Tommy remained focused solely on Webb himself, watching with the kind of patience that his illness had taught him. Webb, for his part, was acutely aware of the boy's presence. There was something different about this young observer, something that set him apart from the typical tourist. The child's stillness, his focused attention, his obvious respect for what he was witnessing, all of it registered in Webb's consciousness. Even as he maintained his rigid posture, through his peripheral vision, Webb could see the details that told Tommy's story. The medical bracelet on his thin wrist, the particular pallor of his skin, the way his mother hovered nearby with the protective instincts of someone who had faced too many medical crises. Webb's own nephew was about the same age, healthy and robust, complaining about homework and soccer practice. The contrast struck him deeply. As the morning progressed, the crowd around them grew and shifted with the natural rhythm of London tourism. Tour groups arrived with their guides, pointing out architectural details and historical significance. Individual visitors came and went, snapping photos and moving on to their next destination. But Tommy remained patient and observant, content to simply watch and learn. "What do you think he's thinking about?" Tommy asked his mother quietly. "Standing there for so long, what goes through his mind?" Elena considered the question, struck by its thoughtfulness. "I don't know, darling. Perhaps he thinks about his duty, about the history he's representing. Or maybe he thinks about staying strong, about being worthy of the uniform he wears." Tommy nodded slowly, processing this idea. "Like when I have to be still for the treatments. Sometimes I think about being brave, about being strong enough to handle whatever comes next." Nearly 2 hours had passed when Elena began to notice signs that Tommy was growing tired. The medications he took made him more sensitive to cold, and despite the blanket and warm clothing, she could see him beginning to shiver slightly. His face had taken on the pale, drawn look that usually preceded his need for rest. "We should probably head back soon," she suggested gently, placing a caring hand on his shoulder. "You have your appointment this afternoon, and you need to conserve your energy." Tommy nodded reluctantly, but his eyes remained fixed on Webb. There was something he wanted to do, something he had been building up the courage to attempt throughout their long vigil. "Mom," he said quietly, "I want to tell him something. Just one thing, and then we can go." Elena's heart clenched. She understood the rules about not disturbing the guards, knew that they were trained to maintain their ceremonial silence regardless of what occurred around them. But she also understood that her son's time was precious, that moments like these might not come again. "What would you like to tell him?" she asked carefully. Tommy's eyes lit up with a clarity that often surprised the adults around him. "I want him to know that watching him has helped me, that seeing how he stands so strong and steady has given me ideas about how to be brave during my treatments." The simple honesty of the statement, the desire to share his own struggle with someone he viewed as a fellow warrior, made Elena's decision clear. If her son wanted to speak to the guardsmen, she would make it possible. "All right," she agreed, her voice steady despite the emotions churning within her. "But we need to be respectful. If he can't respond, we'll understand that it's because of his duties, not because he doesn't care." Tommy nodded eagerly, his fatigue temporarily forgotten in his excitement. Elena wheeled him closer to Webb's position, bringing them within easy speaking distance while still maintaining appropriate respect for the guardsman's role. "Excuse me, sir," Tommy said, his young voice clear and polite. "I know you're probably not supposed to talk to people, but I wanted to tell you something important." Webb felt every nerve in his body respond to the boy's words. This was precisely the kind of interaction his training had prepared him to handle well-meaning civilians who sought to engage with him during his ceremonial duties. The correct response was to maintain his position, to let the moment pass without acknowledgement. But something about Tommy's voice, about the respectful way he had approached, made Webb pause. In his peripheral vision, he could see the boy looking up at him with those bright, earnest eyes, waiting patiently for some form of recognition. "My name is Tommy," the boy continued, undeterred by Webb's silence. "I'm 8 years old, and I have something called acute lymphoblastic leukemia. That means I spend a lot of time in the hospital getting medicine. That's supposed to help me get better." Elena closed her eyes briefly, both proud of her son's courage and terrified of how this interaction might unfold. Around them, other tourists had begun to take notice, sensing that something unusual was happening. "I've been watching you for a really long time," Tommy continued, "and I've been learning from you. When I have to sit still for my treatments, when the medicine makes me feel sick and I want to give up, I remember how you stand here so straight and strong. It helps me be brave." The words struck Webb like a physical blow. Here was this child, this incredibly brave young boy facing a battle that would challenge the strongest adults. Finding inspiration in what he perceived as Webb's strength, the guardsman felt something shift inside his chest, some carefully constructed barrier of professional detachment beginning to crack. Tommy paused, gathering his courage for what he wanted to say next. "I was wondering, sir, if you think I might be able to touch your hat just for a second. I promise I'd be very, very careful with it." The request hung in the air, like a challenge to everything Webb had been trained to believe about protocol and procedure. The bearskin hat was more than just a piece of uniform. It was a sacred symbol of military tradition, a tangible link to centuries of service and sacrifice. It was never removed during duty hours, never handled by civilians, never treated as anything other than the solemn emblem it represented. But as Webb truly looked at Tommy for the first time, really saw him, he encountered something that transcended every rule and regulation that had governed his military life. He saw a young warrior fighting a war that no child should have to fight, asking not for pity or special treatment, but for a moment of connection with someone he regarded as a fellow soldier. The crowd around them had grown quiet instinctively, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Tourists who had been chattering and taking photographs moments before now stood in respectful silence, somehow recognizing the gravity of the moment unfolding before them. Webb made his choice, with movements that seemed to occur in slow motion. He reached up and carefully removed his bearskin hat. The action was so unprecedented, so completely outside the realm of normal protocol, that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. Elena felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched this stranger choose compassion over regulation. Without his towering hat, Webb appeared more human, more approachable, though his bearing remained unmistakably that of a professional soldier. His brown hair was cut in the standard military style, slightly dampened from the morning's duty. Webb knelt down beside Tommy's wheelchair, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. Up close, he could see the full extent of Tommy's battle, the slight yellowing of his skin from medications, the way his hospital identification bracelet caught the light, the small adhesive bandage on his hand wherein had recently been placed. "Guardsman Tommy," Webb said, his voice gentle but carrying the full authority of his rank. "It would be my honor to share this symbol of service with a fellow soldier who has shown such remarkable courage." The formal words, spoken with genuine respect and sincerity, transformed the simple gesture into something approaching a military ceremony. Tommy's eyes widened with wonder and disbelief as Webb carefully placed the massive bearskin hat on his small head. The hat was enormous on Tommy's slight frame, settling down over his ears and nearly obscuring his eyes. But the boy's smile was radiant, a beam of pure joy that seemed to illuminate the entire courtyard. He sat as straight as his weakened body would allow, attempting to embody the same dignity and bearing he had observed in Webb. "How do I look, Mom?" Tommy asked, his voice slightly muffled by the hat but vibrant with excitement. Elena was crying openly now, no longer concerned about who might see her tears. "You look like a proper guardsman," she managed to say through her emotion. "You look absolutely perfect." The crowd around them had begun to applaud, a gentle recognition of the beauty of the moment they had witnessed. But Webb wasn't finished with his impromptu ceremony. From his uniform pocket, he produced a small commemorative pin identical to those given to new recruits when they first joined the regiment. It was a modest thing, simply metal and enamel, but it represented something far more significant: acceptance, recognition, membership in a brotherhood of service. "This pin," Webb explained as he carefully attached it to Tommy's jacket, "is awarded to soldiers who have demonstrated exceptional courage in the face of adversity. I can think of no one more deserving of this recognition than you, Guardsman Tommy." Tommy reached up with trembling fingers to touch the pin, his small face serious with the weight of the honor being bestowed upon him. "Thank you, sir," he whispered. "I promise I'll try to be worthy of it." "You already are," Webb replied firmly. "You're one of the bravest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to meet." The moment stretched on, suspended in time like a photograph that would be burned into the memories of everyone present. Webb remained kneeling beside Tommy's wheelchair, his own military bearings somehow enhanced rather than diminished by this act of humanity. "Now," Webb said, his voice taking on the tone of a drill instructor, but softened with warmth. "Let's see that salute I know you've been practicing. Right hand up, fingers straight and together, movement sharp and precise." He demonstrated the gesture with crisp precision, his hand moving from his side to his temple in one fluid motion. Tommy watched intently, then attempted to mirror the movement. His execution was slower, less precise than Webb's, but it carried something else, a determination that spoke of countless hours of practice, of a child who had studied these movements with the dedication of a scholar. "Outstanding form, guardsman," Webb said, returning the salute with military precision. "You've clearly been putting in the work." The exchange of salutes seemed to complete some invisible circuit, connecting these two soldiers across the vast divide of age, experience, and circumstance. In that moment, they were not guardsman and tourist, adult and child, healthy and ill. They were simply two warriors acknowledging each other's courage. As the crowd around them continued to express their appreciation, Webb caught sight of a familiar figure approaching through the gathering of tourists. Palace Administrator David Thornberry was making his way toward them, his expression a mixture of concern and official displeasure. Webb had been expecting this. His breach of protocol would not go unnoticed by the palace hierarchy, but as Thornberry drew closer and observed the scene before him, his expression began to change. The stern disapproval gradually melted away, replaced by something that looked remarkably like wonder. Here was a senior palace official, a man who had dedicated his career to managing the intricate details of royal protocol, witnessing something that transcended all the rules and regulations he had spent his life enforcing. Instead of the sharp reprimand Webb had been anticipating, Thornberry simply stopped and watched. After a moment, he too began to applaud, adding his recognition to the growing appreciation of the crowd. Tommy, still wearing the massive bearskin hat, looked around at all the faces watching him with expressions of warmth and admiration. For a child who had spent so much of his young life being looked at with pity and concern, this moment of being seen as something heroic was overwhelming. "I feel like a real soldier," he whispered to his mother, his voice filled with awe. Elena, still emotional, reached out to adjust the hat slightly so Tommy could see better. "You are a real soldier, sweetheart. You're the bravest soldier any of us have ever known." The weight of the moment seemed to settle on everyone present. This wasn't merely a kind gesture from a guardsman to a sick child. It was a recognition of courage, a passing of honor from one generation of warriors to the next. The ceremonial aspects of military life, often dismissed as mere pageantry, suddenly revealed their deeper purpose: to honor bravery wherever it was found, to connect past and present in an unbroken chain of service and sacrifice. Webb began to sense that the moment was drawing to a natural close. As much as he wanted to continue, he had duties to return to, and Tommy clearly needed rest. But there was one final element he wanted to add to this impromptu ceremony. "Guardsman Tommy," he said formally, "it has been an exceptional honor to serve alongside you today. When you return to your battles, remember that you carry with you the respect and admiration of the entire regiment. We are proud to count you among our ranks." The formal words, delivered with the gravity of a battlefield commendation, seemed to transform Tommy in that moment. Despite his small size, despite the illness that had weakened his body, he sat straighter in his wheelchair, his chin lifted, with a dignity that would have been impressive in a soldier twice his age. "Thank you, sir," Tommy replied, his voice stronger than it had been all morning. "I won't disappoint you." Webb slowly reached out and carefully lifted the bearskin hat from Tommy's head, his movements reverent and precise. The hat had left Tommy's hair slightly disheveled, and his mother reached out to smooth it down, her touch gentle and loving. As Webb placed the hat back on his own head, settling it into its proper position, he seemed to transform back into the stoic guardsman he had been all morning. But something fundamental had changed. There was a warmth around his eyes, a softness that hadn't been there before. The crowd began to disperse gradually, many of them wiping away tears, all of them carrying with them the memory of what they had witnessed. This was the kind of moment that would be shared in phone calls to family members, posted on social media, remembered and riddled for years to come. But for Tommy, the experience was far from over. As his mother prepared to wheel him away, he reached out and tugged at her sleeve. "Mom," he said quietly, "I want to write him a letter. When we get back to the hotel, I want to write a proper thank you letter." Elena nodded, understanding the importance of this gesture for her son. "Of course, darling. We'll write it together." as they began to move away from the palace gates. Tommy twisted in his wheelchair to look back at Webb, who had resumed his position and his ceremonial expression. The guardsman's eyes flickered briefly toward the departing boy, and for just a moment, their gazes met across the growing distance. Tommy raised his hand in a small wave, and though Webb couldn't respond overtly, Tommy was certain he saw the slightest nod of acknowledgement, a secret message between two soldiers who had found something in each other that transcended the boundaries of their very different battles. The journey back to their hotel was quiet. Tommy lost in thought as he processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. The commemorative pin was still attached to his jacket, catching the light as they moved through the London streets. He touched it frequently, as if to reassure himself that the entire experience hadn't been a dream. That evening, in their modest hotel room near the hospital, Tommy sat at the small writing desk with a pad of paper and a pen, his brow furrowed in concentration as he carefully composed his letter. His handwriting was unsteady, a side effect of his medications, but his words were clear and heartfelt. "Dear Mr. Webb," he began, then paused, realizing he didn't actually know the guardsman's surname. "I don't know your full name, but I want to thank you for today. You made me feel like a real soldier, like someone who could be brave even when things are really scary." He wrote about his treatments, about the long nights in the hospital, about how he had watched videos of the Royal Guard to help him find the courage to face each day. He wrote about how seeing Webb's discipline and dedication had inspired him to be strong, even when his body felt weak. "I'm going to keep practicing my salute," he wrote near the end of the letter, "and I'm going to wear my pin to all my treatments from now on. Thank you for making me feel like a hero even though I'm just a kid who's sick." The letter, when completed, was for pages long, a remarkable achievement for a child dealing with the effects of chemotherapy. Elena helped him fold it carefully and place it in an envelope, which Tommy insisted on addressing himself despite his shaking hands. The next morning, they delivered the letter to the palace gates, where a different guardsman stood at attention. Elena explained the situation to a palace official, who promised that the letter would be delivered to the appropriate person. They had no way of knowing if it would ever reach Webb, but the act of writing it had been important to Tommy, a way of completing the circle of connection that had begun the day before. Meanwhile, Webb had returned to his barracks that evening, to find himself the center of attention in a way he had never experienced before. Word of his gesture had spread throughout the regiment, and his fellow guardsmen approached him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "Was it worth the risk?" asked Private Martinez, a younger man who had always been meticulous about following protocol. "I mean, they're going to have to address this breach of procedure." Webb considered the question as he cleaned his rifle, a nightly ritual that helped him process the events of each day. "There are rules," he said finally, "and then there are moments when doing what's right matters more than following what's written." Today was one of those moments. The expected summons to the commanding officer's office came the following morning. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was a career military man who had served in 2 different conflicts before taking command of the palace guard. His office was filled with the kinds of ceremonial objects that spoke to decades of service: medals, commendations, photographs of royal events. "Guardsman Webb," the colonel began, his voice carrying the weight of military authority, "I assume you understand why you've been called here." "Yes, sir. I violated protocol yesterday morning by removing my bearskin hat while on duty and allowing a civilian to wear it." "That's correct. And you understand that such behavior is completely contrary to the standards we maintain as representatives of the crown?" Webb stood at attention, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind the colonel's head. "Yes, sir. I understand." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison studied the younger man for a long moment, taking in his perfect posture, his unwavering gaze, the evidence of a soldier who had never before given his superiors cause for concern. "Tell me about the child," the colonel said finally. The question seemed to catch Webb off guard. He had been prepared for discipline, for a formal reprimand, perhaps even for dismissal from the palace guard. He had not been prepared for this request to explain his actions. "His name was Tommy, sir. 8 years old. He's fighting leukemia." Webb paused, searching for the right words. "He'd been watching me for nearly 2 hours, sir. Not like the tourists usually do, but like he was learning from me, drawing strength from what he saw." The colonel nodded slowly, processing this information. "And you felt compelled to respond to that?" "Sir, I have a nephew about his age, healthy, active boy who worries about video games and school tests." Webb's voice grew quieter. "This child Tommy, he's fighting a battle that would break most adults. And he was finding courage in what he saw as my strength, my discipline. So you gave him your hat. I gave him recognition. Sir, I gave him a moment of feeling like the warrior he already was. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison walked to the window of his office, which looked out over the palace courtyard where guardsmen like Webb stood their daily posts. He had been commanding soldiers for nearly 25 years, and he had seen courage take many forms. But there was something about this story that resonated with him in a way that surprised him. You know, he said, still facing the window, when I was a young officer in Bosnia, I once saw a sergeant share his meal with a group of local children who were hungry. It was against regulations; those rations were strictly allocated, and sharing them with civilians was prohibited. He turned back to face Webb, who remained at attention. But sometimes, guardsmen, the spirit of service transcends the letter of the law. Sometimes being a soldier means recognizing that our duty extends beyond the specific orders we've been given. Webb felt a flicker of hope, but he maintained his rigid posture. That said, the colonel continued, I cannot simply ignore a clear breach of protocol. The palace guard exists on the foundation of absolute discipline and adherence to procedure. If I let this slide without consequence, it could set a precedent that undermines everything we represent. The hope in Webb's chest began to dim. Therefore, I am issuing you a formal reprimand for breach of protocol. It will be documented in your file, and you will be assigned additional duties. For the next 2 weeks, the colonel paused, and a slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. However, I am also recommending you for a commendation for exceptional community service. Your actions yesterday embodied the finest traditions of the British Army, and I believe they deserve recognition. Webb blinked, uncertain he had heard correctly. Sir, you see, guardsman, I received a phone call this morning from Buckingham Palace. It seems that a video of your interaction with young Tommy has been circulating on social media. The palace has been flooded with positive responses from around the world. Her Majesty herself has expressed her approval of your actions. The colonel picked up a tablet from his desk and showed Webb the screen. There, in high definition, was the moment when he had placed his bearskin hat on Tommy's head. The video had been viewed millions of times, shared across every social media platform, and had generated thousands of comments from people expressing their admiration for both the guardsman's compassion and the little boy's courage. It appears, the colonel continued, that your breach of protocol has done more to enhance the reputation of the palace guard than any formal ceremony could have accomplished. The Public Relations Office is calling it the most humanizing moment in recent royal history. Webb watched the video in amazement, seeing himself and Tommy from an outsider's perspective. The ceremony he had improvised looked even more meaningful captured on film. The moment when two very different kinds of soldiers had recognized each other's courage. There's one more thing, the colonel said, reaching into his desk drawer. This was delivered for you this morning. He handed Webb a small envelope, addressed in unsteady handwriting to Mr. Webb. Inside was Tommy's letter, with its heartfelt thanks and its promise to keep practicing his salute. As Webb read the letter, something in his expression softened. Here was this brave little boy, facing battles that would challenge the strongest adults, writing to thank him for a moment of recognition and connection. Sir, Webb said after finishing the letter, I'd like to respond to him, if that's permitted. I'd like him to know that meeting him made me a better soldier. The colonel nodded approvingly. I think that would be entirely appropriate, guardsman. In fact, I think it would be an excellent example of the kind of community engagement we should be encouraging. That evening, Webb sat in his small room in the barracks, composing his own letter to Tommy. Writing had never been his strongest skill. He was a man of action rather than words. But he felt compelled to respond to the boy's heartfelt message. Dear Tommy, he began, thank you for your letter. It means more to me than you could possibly know. You wrote that I made you feel like a hero, but I want you to know that you are the one who showed me what true courage looks like. He wrote about his own challenges, about the times when standing at attention for hours seemed difficult, and how thinking of Tommy's strength during his treatments would now make his own duties seem easier by comparison. You asked me once if I ever get scared, he wrote. The answer is yes, I do. But I've learned that being brave doesn't mean never being scared. It means doing what you need to do even when you are scared. And from what I've seen, you do that every single day. He told Tommy about the other guardsmen who had heard his story, about how they had all been inspired by his courage. He wrote about the tradition of the commemorative pin, about how it connected Tommy to a long line of soldiers who had shown exceptional bravery in the face of adversity. "I want you to know," he concluded, "that whenever I'm standing at my post, I'll be thinking of you. Your courage gives me strength, and I hope that knowing you have an entire regiment of soldiers who consider you one of their own will give you strength too." The letter was delivered to Tommy's hospital room the next day, where he was undergoing another round of chemotherapy. The nurses had decorated his room with get-well cards and drawings from other children, but Tommy's face lit up with special joy when he saw the official palace letterhead. Elena read the letter aloud to him as he lay in his hospital bed, the commemorative pin attached to his hospital gown. With each word, Tommy's smile grew brighter, and by the end of the letter, he was sitting up straighter despite his weakness. "He remembers me," Tommy whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "He really remembers me." The correspondence between Tommy and Webb continued over the following months, with letters traveling back and forth between the hospital and the palace barracks. Tommy would write about his treatments, his good days and difficult days, his hopes and fears. Webb would respond with stories from his duties, observations about the tourists who came to see the palace, and always, reminders of Tommy's courage and strength. The story of their encounter spread far beyond the initial video. News outlets around the world picked up the tale, and soon Tommy became something of a celebrity in the children's cancer community. But more importantly, his story inspired other young patients facing similar battles, showing them that courage could be found in the most unexpected places. Tommy's battle with leukemia lasted another 8 months after his meeting with Webb. During that time, he wore his commemorative pin to every treatment, every doctor's appointment, every difficult moment. It became his talisman, his reminder that he was not alone in his fight. When Tommy finally lost his battle, Webb was among the honor guard at his funeral. The sight of guardsmen in full ceremonial dress, standing at attention for a 9-year-old boy who had shown them the meaning of true courage, brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. Today, Webb continues to serve at the palace gates, but he carries with him the memory of a brave little boy who taught him that sometimes the most important moments happen when we choose humanity over protocol. The commemorative pin that once belonged to Tommy now sits in a place of honor in the Palace Guard's Regimental Museum, a reminder to all who see it that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the most profound impact. The story of Tommy and Webb became part of the Palace Guard's oral tradition, passed down to new recruits as an example of what it truly means to serve. It reminds them that their duty extends beyond ceremony and protocol, that they are guardians not just of a building or a tradition, but of the values that make their service meaningful. And in the end, perhaps that was Tommy's greatest victory, not over his illness, which ultimately claimed his young life, but over the forces of indifference and disconnection that can make the world seem cold and uncaring. He showed that even in the face of overwhelming odds, it was possible to find courage, to inspire others, and to create connections that would last long after any individual life had ended. The guardsmen who chose compassion over protocol learned that some moments are too important for rules, that some connections transcend the boundaries of duty and regulation, and in return, he was given a gift that would last a lifetime: the knowledge that true strength comes not from standing alone, but from recognizing the courage in others and honoring it with the respect it deserves.